I'm Annie Binder, an MFA student, and I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's reading. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Humanities Iowa, the MFA program in Creative Writing and Environment, and the Committee on Lectures. After the reading, we'll have a brief question and answer session, and then I'd like to invite everyone to stay for refreshments, and then also to check out Camille's books that are on the table out there. I'm sure she'll be happy to sign them as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Camille Dungy. As co-founder of From the Fish House, an online audio archive of young poets reading and discussing poetry, Camille had an impact on my poetry education long before I was aware of it. This online resource led to the publication of an anthology of poems by the same name, which Camille co-edited. She's also editor of the anthology Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry. Camille herself is the author of 2, soon-to-be 3, books of poetry. Her first book, What to Eat, What to Drink, and What to Leave for Poison, was a finalist in the Penn Center USA 2007 Literary Awards and the Library of Virginia 2007 Literary Award. The poems in this collection blend complicated human relationships with nature, connecting social history and environmental awareness. The poems in her second book, Suck on the Marrow, give an intimate and unflinching look at the lives of individuals, both slave and free, in the mid-19th century America. The voices that emerge in these poems, though imagined, are true in their communication of hope and of loss. In the poem Survival, the human body, simultaneously resilient and fragile, is compared to the environment. Like a branch floats on water, she writes, the body does not go under. Like a tree seated among dark rocks, the body leans where it must, or fails. This sensitivity to the place of humans as part of a wider natural world characterizes Camille's poetry and allows her work to inform our understanding of the past so that we can make conscientious decisions about the future. Please join me in welcoming Camille Dungy.
Thank you so much, Annie, for that introduction and for my safe transit. She came to Ankeny, Iowa, and collected me this morning and brought me up to Des Moines, or to Ames, I'm sorry. I have been all over the country this quarter, and so sometimes I forget my up from my down. So I thought that I would kind of read from a smattering of the collections that I have represented right now, and I, feeling rather contrarian, thought I would start tonight's poetry reading with an essay. But as I assured some people, it's very definitely the essay of a poet. It's the introduction to one of the sections of Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry. And one of the things that I tried to do with this anthology was to democratize it, to make it accessible for people who are lovers of poetry and teachers of poetry and writers of poetry, but also to people who would not normally pick up a poetry anthology. Because I think that the information that's in it and the standpoints that are conveyed in the work are important enough for a wide variety of people to get an introduction to it. And so this is a section called Growing Out of This Land, which, as it turned out in the organization of the anthology, is the only anthology that does not cover all 4 centuries of African American nature poetry. All of the poets in this section are writing their poems, or the poems were published after 1965. So it's a section about people who are consciously claiming a stake in the land that, and really thinking about alienation and fighting alienation. And I thought it was interesting that in the process of collecting it, it turned out that they were all writers writing after the civil rights movements, Brown v. Board, and some of the major milestones of the civil rights movement had occurred. Writing home. When I was a girl child, home was a street called Bluff View, the uppermost block in a terraced neighborhood of Southern California houses. In the summer, when I was young and untired and forced to bed before the sun went down, my lullaby was the view my bedroom window afforded of the hills behind my house. desert oak, prickly pear, eucalyptus, sage. I fell asleep cataloging this place. In the daytime, I would scramble over one bluff and up the hill behind it, playing teacher in the caves my neighbors and I found, scratching lessons in the chalky sand that lined the walls. We played doctor with stethoscopes fashioned from rocks and the necklace stalks of wild mustard. We knew the contours and passages of those hills like we knew the halls and classrooms of our other inside school. Walking down a slope is different than walking on flat land, and each part of my legs required positions until they could move as correctly up and down those bluffs as my tongue might move over the alphabet. My body memorized its place in those hills. But even while I lived at the center of everything I knew erased itself. Before I entered high school, construction had begun on Summit Estates for our town's growing mogul class. The hilltop was leveled and two of my favorite caves lost. From my bedroom window, I could now see the red tile roof of the Pizza King's Palazzo. Less desert oak, a weaker scent of sage. When my parents bought the house on Bluffview, our backyard marked the edge of human landscaping. It was not uncommon to find tumbleweed resting on our lounge chairs, to leave wild poppies blooming along the margins of cut grass. Now the hills were asphalt and ice plant. The wild dogs we called coyotes moved down into our backyards, fighting with raccoons over scraps from overturned trash cans and preying on small pets. Development in California means the building of homes, the imposition of landscaping, the digging of pools. Development in California means controlling what exists and creating something new, something only the diversion of rivers for the maintenance of reservoirs can sustain. Development in California means the mass irrigation of newly planted lawns, houses everywhere, and not a wild mustard field to see. Not even the acres of organized agriculture that first moneyed the region survive. The city of Orange, in Orange County, keeps an orange tree in a fenced area, one skinny branch specimen saved to represent the fields for which the region was named. And I will stop here to actually say that now there is a plaque where the orange that represented the orange trees existed, and the orange tree is no longer there. It was taken down for a movie set. I wish I was kidding. I grew up on a street called Bluffview in the midst of California's ambition for development. When I write poems about nature, I am writing poems about loss. I am writing poems about discovering home where home has been replaced by structures I do not want to recognize. The place I was born into no longer exists. I don't have a town I can call home, unless language is home, unless when I write, what had slipped away is found. Once, I knew the silence and wind cry of my California hills. In California, the sky speaks with a clipped tongue. Mountains shoulder into the conversation. The ocean sighs in frustration, and that frustration rolls over us is fog. Say the sky and the sea have been arguing all night. Say the mountains blanketed themselves and withdrew into silence, but the sky and the sea kept at it through the night. Say it is finally morning. When the ocean rolls its wave-blue eyes and sighs, no one will believe the bright points the sky still holds on to. When I lived in California, I was at home in the language of sky and mountaintop and sea. But what my parents came to California to find began to slip away, and we moved away as well. I found myself in Iowa, and believed for a long time that I had lost my home. The language of place is a slow speech to learn. Iowa is blue, uninterrupted, blue talking all day, and a darker blue still talking through the night. Just the waist-high tips of new corn there to listen, and they not saying anything, only nodding their young heads. A new language. I moved to Iowa and didn't write for months. When a poem finally came, it was written in a different tongue. Now, it is half my life since I lived on Bluffview, and I have traveled enough and moved enough to know that home is not a place. I am thinking perhaps home is not language either. Language is too easy to lose. Perhaps home is memory. It is years later, and I am a traveler walking. I am on public land, a park, a knoll, a meadow. I am glad to own the memories I own, and through those memories to belong someplace, to have some place belong to me. I am remembering, and I am writing a poem in my many tongues. A poem having to do with comfort, something having to do with peace. Then a dog comes growling toward me. A dog with still tail and pointed ears. A dog with fanged mouth and purposeful eyes. The sky is quiet, and the dog is barking, and someone the dog trusts and will obey says, "Sicker, sick." If memory is home, I am a long way from hope. I have escaped and am running. I have to remember what has been said. I am black and female. No place is for my pleasure. How do I write a poem about the land and my place in it without these memories? The runaway with the hounds at her heels, the complaint of the poplar at the man cry of its load. Land a thing to work, but not to own. How do I write a poem about the land and my place in it without remembering, without shaping my words around this history? The history I belong to, the history that belongs to me. The dog drags me to fields of memory where I toy from can see to can't. When I write poems about the land and my place in it, they are informed by this fact. Sometimes the landscape is of little comfort. Sometimes I want to run far away from home. When I was a child, in the hills behind the street called Bluffview, I knew no threat nor fear. Development, the advancement of possession, had not pushed coyotes from the hillside into our backyards. My poems about nature are informed by displacement and oppression, but they are also informed by peace, by self-possession. When I was a child on Bluffview, the dogs we called bloodhounds, the slave tracker's tool, were nothing I knew to remember. I was a girl child in that kingdom of open space, and all the land I could see and name and touch was mine to love. No one, no thing possessed another. Nothing was developed apart from my heart. When I was a child in the hills behind the street called Bluffview, there was no such thing as history. Sometimes my poems rest again in that quiet space, that comfort. The dog is closer, and the woman repeats her command, but it is something altogether different this time. Sit, girl, sit. What place, what words, what memories should I trust? Which direction will take me home? So I thought I'd start with that because I thought it would give a frame for the rest of the poems that I was going to read today, because I love your creative writing program in creative writing and the environment. And I love that idea of thinking about the environment and all the different ways that we can think about it as this place that we live, these biospheres we share, the body that we have in all the different ways. And so I thought I would start by letting you know that this is already an obsession of mine as we come in. So now I'm going to read a few poems from my first book, What to Eat, What to Drink, What to Leave for Poison. What happened with this book was I moved from California to North Carolina and then Virginia, which were about as hugely different environments as one could ever imagine and experience. And many of my poems in those years were about trying to figure out where I'd landed. Fear. Do not change your soap. I will not know you. Fresh from the shower, you smell sharp, like a stone. I call it love. Like my knowledge of this hillside, sage on the steepest slope, eucalyptus near the rocky caves. This is how I find my way home. I would race back and forth from the East Coast to California and take the red eye back, slide into class on Monday morning, and start all over again for a couple months, and then race back to California and slide back. And one time I was out there in San Francisco, and I wrote this poem, and which I only tell you because I do believe in the power of language. The week that this book came out, I also signed the contract to take me back to the place where I wrote this poem. Long time gone, long time yet to come. Where jasmine, lemon sweets wind, and salt slicks the breeze. Where sage spices sun drench. There, where the fragrant cloud nest drives the pump beat of my blood, I am home. Long time gone, and don't know when I'm coming back, but see me there, where the orange tree blossoms and the sky smells white as line-dried sheets. See me there, where jasmine, lemon sweets wind, and salt slicks the hair you wear into the breeze, where cactus fruit is suckling pear and its sweet hidden waters everywhere. I am home. I'm gone, but I'll be back. Long time gone, but I'll be coming back. And I'll read one more poem from this book right now, which is also in From the Fish House anthology. And so that whole project started when my twin brother, you can go to the Fish House website and take a look at him and see why I smiled. We were born on the same day, same year, within minutes of each other, counting for time changes between Maine and Colorado. He was driving back and forth to work. It was about an hour commute each way, and he wanted to work on his poems and listen to poems that he liked. And this was 2005, amazingly recently. It was very difficult to find the work of emerging writers online in audio form. And so he sent me a tape recorder, or like it was not a tape recorder, it was like an early digital recorder. And he asked me to record a few poems, and he asked me if there were other poets that I admired whose work he might like to listen to. And from that group of 10 poets, each time we get a new poet on the Fish House, we ask them for a few recommendations. And we've grown virally that way, have over 250 poets, over 2,000 poems and questions and answers and things like that. And the real key of it is that we really, really, really are valuing the oral nature of poetry, how poetry can sound. So this is one of my poems in the Fish House anthology. The Preachers Eat Out. There were maybe 4 of them, perhaps 5. They were headed where? It does not matter. Only they were not home yet. Were not near anyone who could have cared. So hungry, they stopped there anyway. And when they heard, "We don't serve your kind," one among them laughed. "That's okay. We're not hungry for our kind. We've come for food." And when the one waitress who would serve them, she had children at home, and these were tips, finished breaking their plates behind the building, he called her over to the table. "Lady, my one regret is that we don't have appetite enough to make you break every damned plate inside this room." So there I was living in Virginia, in the town that turned out was the town where my grandfather had his first church and his first academic position, and where my mother and aunt were born, the town from which they departed in 1953. And I was back for my first tenure-track position at the same school where my grandfather was not allowed to study in the library. And if you know anything about American civil rights history, you know that 1953 was not the best time to have left, with your memory stopping there. So my grandmother, who was a very good preacher's wife, and there is nothing wrong in the world because all will be made right eventually in the Lord, had a lot of bad things to say about Lynchburg, Virginia, where I was landing and ended up living for 7 years. And so I had to sort of take this history, this family history and this collective history, and try and figure out how I was going to live there, how to make sense of it. And so that's where the book, What to Eat and What to Drink and What to Leave for Poison, that's where the poems came from. I think of it as rather a guidebook, a survival book that talks about the different ways that people figured out how to make a place for themselves in a world that would prefer for them not to make a place for themselves. And some of the lessons are good. You get that kind of wit and strength and power of the preacher who just spoke in that poem. Some of the lessons not so good. I've got an O.J. Simpson poem in it. We can learn from people who do things we oughtn't do also. And that was the first collection. And then I thought, I don't ever want to write about anybody who ever really lived again. It was really hard. You're responsible to people that they know, and you can go and look up Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and tell whether or not my facts are right. So I'm going to make up characters all on my own, and that's going to be so much easier. So I spent 4 years researching and writing my next collection, which is also set partly in Virginia and partly in Philadelphia, which was the town to which I always ran away. And it turned out that I still, so if What to Eat was my 20th century survival guide, Suck on the Marrow is my 19th century survival guide book. Aspire. August, and a lash of gnats is certain, prophesied. Corn and wheat realize their ambition while hands twist, harvesting through fields. Gnats and heat and work songs engorge the clotted air. Horses wear straw hats and join tree-shaded whipmen. Everything they do is done with the sanctioned ease of the master's favorite pup. The horses are absurd with laughter as they watch the harvest's progress. One summer dawning, shad will not rise. The vermin and heat will light around him. The chant of the tedious season will mark time, but he will be still in the cool clay of his cabin. All he wants to be, still. Survival. The body winnows, the body tills, the body knows sow's feet, sow gut, night harvested kale. The body knows to sleep through welted dreams, to wake before the night succumbs to morning. Wheat, tobacco, corn, the body knows. No stopping, no sinking down. Like a branch floats on water, the body does not go under. Like a tree seated among dark rocks, the body leans where it must or fails. So this book ended up being a novel in verse in which I follow 6 characters through their different experiences in Virginia or Philadelphia. And it's sort of a an eddy system where some people start out in Virginia and move up to Philadelphia. Some people start in Philadelphia and are kidnapped and brought down to Virginia. And then some people just stay put on either side, sort of bobbing around in that caught in those currents. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was explore different ways that people handle their situations. So I do have a woman who runs away and she escapes north to Philadelphia. But I also have a woman from the same household who just runs further south into the brothel district. Because if you think about it, she, in some senses, made the choice then of the kinds of abuse that she would experience. She had this weird, strange control over her body in that way. And also, there she is in the red light district, and what are you going to do? Say, I just saw your girl down there at the brothel, right? So she has this anonymity that she's managed to get for herself with this strange, altered agency that she also claims. So this poem uses some Bible verses, and this character, along with stealing herself, also chooses her own name. And as we move through the poem, I'm going to quote the Bible verse which will describe the genesis of her names, and also read the poem, and you'll learn a little bit about one of the, I think, rather ingenious escape strategies. And thou shalt be called a new name, which the mouth of the Lord shall name. For Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest, I will not rest until the righteous go. It was the roaming creature's birthright she was after, so she marked the wanderings of a sick buck till it died. It was the wild creature's right to free death she desired. The righteous go forth as the brightness, the righteous go forth as the brightness and the salvation thereof, as the lamps that burneth. She marked the falling of a sick buck when it died, then stowed her traveling dress beneath the carcass. In 3 days, she'd made a stench skirt. To slow the hounds still more, she polished her boots in his hides wrought, sweet oil. And the Gentiles shall see, the Gentiles shall see thy righteousness, and all the kings shall see thy glory. She named herself Rebecca because that woman knew smell could run privilege out of a brute's tent and secure it for the child she favored. Thou shalt no more be called forsaken, neither shall thy land be termed desolate. She was a while preparing, but when she smelled most like disappearing, she was gone. One of the things that I found interesting in that aspect of the research was that the dogs would then be trained to smell humans, right? So we think of dogs as hunting dogs that would be trained to track deer, and she sort of played the reverse on this, and the deer weren't of interest to these particular hounds, and off she slipped right under the noses, literally under the noses of those who were looking for her. So this book is all set in the 19th century, and there's some hard history in that part of the American landscape. And the poems were often difficult to write. Part of the pleasure that I had in it was the experience of doing the research and figuring out how to incorporate the materials that I was learning and to put it into the book in vibrant ways and new ways, so that you weren't just reading a textbook story, you were reading about people. And so I played around with that. I played around with the language a lot. I played around with all of the different life that we might see. There's a man in the book who is kidnapped from Philadelphia and taken into Virginia. And we meet him at the beginning of the book, and then at the end of the book, we meet his wife, Melinda. And I'll just read a short segment from Melinda's section. The title of the poem should make you think a little bit of the Ulysses story. And I'm always interested in that story, that Penelope sort of patiently waits for however long for her husband to come back. And I mean, I really love my husband, but I wonder if I would have that patience to wait for that amount of time for somebody who might never return. Unravel and weave. When I hang Mr. Cartwright's trousers on a line with no thought as to how the leg would taper down Joe's calf, I am nothing more than myself, and happy to be Melinda Young, now Freeman. But, of course, I am no longer young, and no more Freeman than Hattie down the alley, whose old man, Elijah the porter, went off 10 years since with another gal, is a porter's bride. Because there is no dirt turned over the body I love, because the hands that stole my plans were neither death's nor some other seductress, because I have no body to blame, no betrayal to explain my kidnapped ambition, there are moments I can do nothing but forget I must be someone's widow, someone's abandoned wife. It is difficult to answer if I am more or less myself in the late evenings when I take calls from men like Richard Turnbridge, who would have me drop Freeman and fold myself into his name. And who am I when I am waiting on the corner? Just Melinda, watching for the break between the carts and carriages, wondering only when the time will come when it is quiet enough for me to walk into the road. So one of the charges that I knew that I had when I was writing this book was to find places to situate joy. Because I know nobody goes through life, no matter how hard life is, without finding some places for joy and some places for peace and rest. And one of the things that happens when we write about characters we don't know is that it's sometimes hard to create that sort of dimensionality. We sort of know them as the people suffering, and then how do we figure out how to give them joy? Or we know them as the really happy people, and how do you balance them, essentially? Luckily, there's research. There are archives. There are all kinds of places that we can find ideas that flutter down to us. So I had this really, really, really lucky opportunity to be a fellow for 1 month at the American Antiquarian Society. And as the Creative Arts Fellow, I didn't have to focus just on something really, really, really specific. I could just wander in and ask the librarians to bring me whatever struck my fancy that day. And I was in the mood to read almanacs because I was setting my characters in particular times, and I was watching the tracking the moon, and then the year Joseph Freeman was kidnapped, there was a major eclipse, and I was doing all this fun stuff with that. And so that was why I was reading almanacs. But in the back of one particular almanac, somebody had written a series of notes, and I just borrowed from those notes to write this poem. Observation on the return of migratory birds. I record each arrival. Early and late, the birds are returning. The blue jay, March 1. Pigeons and robins, the week before my birthday. I am only here in the last week of April, seeing chickadees wing back and gather nesting. I need the eye I am when I am witnessing this small and songful resolution. Feathered collations, ledge-perched, tufted shadows skimming our alley's cobbles, and then gone, and then back again. When these flitters return to my block of the Black Ward one morning and stay on into the evening, always, I notice, I smile. So those are a little taste from Suck on the Marrow. And now I'm going to go back to the anthology and read newer poem from it. I'm also actually going to read a poem not by me. I'm going to read the poem that I use as the preface for the anthology, and it's by the now late, always great Lucille Clifton, who I have always thought of as a model for much of my work. She was an amazing woman, an amazing poet, a woman of incredible precision with language. She could just hone right in on whatever it was she needed to say. She said it was partly because she was the mother of 5 children and she didn't have time for long, rambling poems. But I also think it was just she had a very incisive mind and was able to do that. Surely I am able to write poems celebrating grass and how the blue in the sky can flow green or red, and the waters lean against the Chesapeake shore like a familiar. Poems about nature and landscape, surely. But whenever I begin, the trees wave their knotted branches, and why is there under that poem always an other poem? So I use that as the preface for Black Nature because I think it really shapes a lot of the argument that I'm making in this book. That African American writers, even when we write about the natural world, are very frequently also writing another poem. And so all of those nature poems that I just read you from Suck on the Marrow would really rarely be anthologized or collected in a journal of environmental poetry or nature poetry because they're so deeply historically charged and socially charged, etc. And which means that we erase a whole slew of kinds of writing out there, of people who are writing and thinking about the world and thinking about the environment, but also thinking about other things at the same time. And so this next poem I'm going to read is from my forthcoming collection called Smith Blue. The title, Smith Blue, is borrows its name from the name of a butterfly that's an endangered butterfly on the Central California coast. And it was discovered by these 2 Berkeley students, one of whom was swallowed by a sneaker wave, which are these waves that just come along, you're just like walking along the coast, and it's lovely and nice, and then here comes the ocean. And they can be very dangerous and totally sudden. And so there's these 2 guys, they're very good friends. One of them gets lost by this completely fickle act of the natural world. The butterfly gets named after the one that gets lost. It's now an endangered species on this quickly populating California coast. The poems in this new collection are about all these kinds of things. They're about love and loss and the fickleness of the natural world and the fickle way we treat the natural world and war and, etc. And fun and enjoyment and pleasure somehow in the face of all that yuck. I will tell you that this poem is something of a braided poem, so there are several storylines going on at one time. You may get lost. That's okay. Ride the wave. Since everyone can never be safe. The bitch ran in the pack, and nothing about that was remarkable except the sight of her intestines on the ground, as well as in her gut. But we were yakking about kids before we turned to dogs. They were playing, what do you call that game? Kids scattered in pairs across the yard, elbows linked, the lot of them, except the one who was it and one other one. We were working 50 weeks a year now, adult hours. These dinners were a decadence we could easily afford. The loose toms and spayed pups we called our own, even they knew there was more than enough and no longer beat us to the bowls we filled 2 times each day. If the kid whose it's too close, the other kid'll grab some arm. Then, the kid whose partner got the grab, now he's got to be the one to run. My friend, she'd seen those dogs and had that night, though I'm sure we hadn't asked her, to tell us about them. The thing that got me was these kids. They kept screaming, Trevor, 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 and holding out their arms. Then it was Maria, 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 when Trevor grabbed someone. most of us have been to the place she was talking about. God, it was hot, one of us remembered. Oh, and that flatbread. We said, remember the west bank of the river? How lazy that afternoon was? They'd yell, Maria, Maria, and wave their little arms. Though any arm that got the grab, that meant some other kid would have to run. Dinner that night, if I can recall, consisted of several courses: lamb shake on a bed of cracked barley, chickpeas, home-cured olives, a chutney or two, arugula salad with cashews and organic tomatoes, thick crusted bread, a healthy soup, something sweet to top it off, a plenitude of wine. It was only the way she dragged herself along the street, my friend remembered. Like she was all together and not dripping apart, not dragging her own stomach down the road. It was only the way that bitch acted, how normal she made all of it seem. Nothing remarkable, those dogs, their hunger. I mean, what were they looking to do? Even the way they consumed the bitch, those dogs. My friend wanted us to see how easy it seemed watching all of this go down. That pack was unremarkable. She almost overlooked them, really. The way they got behind her and on top, that everyone was eating. Nothing could be less remarkable than that. And I'm going to close with one last poem, which is also in both the anthology and one of my books. And I'm closing with it again in the same way I started, to just talk about the way that my way of understanding this world and living in it has always, and probably will always, shape my language and my use of language and the way I think about my poems and my life. Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky and the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze while the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand, water her brush, spells, and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather the bank we map our lives around. Thank you. So now the word on the street is I am open, and it's true too, is that I'm open to answer questions for anybody who has a question. There's a microphone lady running around for you there. Oh, come on, just one. I can even repeat your question, so if the mic doesn't work, that's okay.
Well, you mentioned writing about other people and real people and responsibility. How would you advise other writers who are doing similar things to approach it?
Yeah, so there is this huge responsibility, and that's true. And then, as with a lot of the fact of writing for me, I just ignore that responsibility for the period of the drafting of the poem, right, or the essay. When I'm doing that part of the work, I'm just writing because there are enough sensors running around our brain that the what will this person say, what will the Ella Fitzgerald expert say, is the last thing that you need to emit into your brain. So for a number of drafts and revisions of the poem, just write what it is you need to know and figure out the truths that you're going to get to. But at some point, just like you're going to do, I hope that you're going to do a revision that looks for consistency of tense, right, or consistency of punctuation, you're just also going to look for a poem that's consistency of fact, if it is a real person's life. Now, I'm going to say this in the presence of my father. He might not know this, but it's true as I know it. Which is the other thing about fact, right? Fact is truth as you know it. So my first collection, it deals a lot with my family. And my father is a relatively quiet, private man. And that part of the family isn't a history that goes batted about all the time, right? So I have this whole section about his family, which isn't really public, right? And I asked him, do you mind, right, before I sent it out for submission. And luckily, I have an incredibly supportive family. My father's like, yeah, whatever. And he's like my number one champion. And he is like sells my book like Girl Scout cookies and stuff like that. But like, if he had said no, then what? Then what, right? Like, then I wouldn't have this book. So I'm not sure, as much as I love my father, that I would ever give somebody that power, that veto power again, right? I trusted those poems. I believed that those stories needed to be told and that I was telling them as honestly and as truthfully as possible, and that's what I had to have based my faith on, right? So that was a sort of young decision on my part to give over, and luckily I gave it to somebody who was worthy of that trust, but most people actually aren't. So that's a long kind of answer, but the essential answer is it's a fact that you need to think about, and it's a fact that you have to attend to at one process in revision, but it's not something that should silence you. And there are other people who say that they've written things and they've done things and they're just not going to publish it. Lucille Clifton, she wrote a lot of poems about the abuse that she suffered at the hands of her father, that she never published until after her father was dead, because even in the face of that abuse, she had a relationship with her father that she did not feel that part of their life needed to be made public while he was still alive. So that's a decision that you can also make. But she made that decision, and he didn't, right? How about somebody else? Yeah, okay, so the question, this is for posterity. The question was essentially, did I find people who surprised me as I was collecting Black Nature because of the groups that they may or may not have been in? And the answer is absolutely yes. I found people who surprised me. I found people who surprised other people who read this work a lot. And I actually found people who surprised the people. So when I went to Living Poets and said, I would like to include your poem in my Black Nature anthology, they would look at me like, this is a poem about my hometown in Georgia. What does that have to do? I was like, do you notice how many, like, you're a birder, dude. You have all kinds of references to birds and animals, and you were a shepherd when you grew up. What do you mean you don't think of yourself in this lens? But he just had it, right? And it happened very, very frequently, that people have been so used to being categorized in other categories that they had never considered that they were writing in this way. And so that was really very, very exciting to be able to find work that way. And sometimes I did a sort of backhanded open call, and that backhanded open call was really open so that people would submit to this. It was a really great journal called Ecotone Reimagining Place. It's a fabulous journal. And so they're submitting to this journal about place-based writing and things, right? And then I'm plucking the poems out for my purposes. So that was a way that I kind of fooled everybody in and got the poems that I needed. So, yes. Thank you. What does my future work entail? Well, so this third book is the fastest movement from completion of a manuscript to publication of a manuscript that I've ever experienced. So most of my books take about 4 to 6 years from conclusion to when I see them. And this book, I just finished collecting it this summer, and it will be out in summer of 2011. So that's really, really quick. And it left me actually rather barren of unpublished work. So I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm going to have to figure it out. My life is about to rapidly change. This June, I'm going to have my first child. So I would imagine that my poems are going to start looking very different. And as you noted, that last poem I read was about 3 times as long as the other poems that I read, right? So the poems in Smith Blue are very often 2, sometimes there's like a couple 8-page poems in that collection. I have a feeling that with a new child, I'm not going to be writing 8-page poems. Could be wrong, but I just assume that that's not going to happen. So there's going to be some formal changes that I get to experience and see, and that's happened with each of my books, is that each collection is somehow a resistance against the formal strategies that I've taken in the last, as well as the subject matter, and I just don't know, which is really kind of exciting. Thank you. Yeah, so the translation of history and research into work, written work. One of the things is that my poems are really very often character-driven. So I dream in narrative, I dream in character-based sort of dreams. They're like little soap operas in my brain, and it shows up that way in my work as well. And so the material from the archives has to fit a person in the poems, and that then has it grounded, so it's not just stuff, it's not just facts floating around, but facts in the hands of some person, right? A noun meets a verb, essentially, and that's where I have the fun of it. And it's also sometimes a challenge. There's stories, one of my favorite stories along these lines is I'd gone to a plantation where outside of Richmond, where a man who worked on a slave rebellion that didn't work. It's called Gabriel Prosper's Rebellion, where he lived. And long before the slave rebellion, he was already sort of a marked man, literally a marked man. He had a T branded on his thumb because he'd stolen a shoat and eaten it, and it was marked with this T for thief. And I thought, well, that's great. I've got to get this into this book, this idea of somebody who steals a shoat. First of all, shoat is such a great word, right? Not young pig, shoat. It's awesome. And so I wanted that word, and I wanted the T on the hand, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I failed over and over and over again. Well, the word shoat is in this book, and the T on somebody's thumb is in this book, and eventually there were the characters who needed those words in their mouths or on their bodies, right? And that those moments came eventually from practice and writing. But it wasn't a retelling of the Gabriel Prosper story, which was my original problem, was I was trying to retell something that wasn't my story to tell. I had my own story that I needed to tell, and you just kind of have to wait around until you can figure it out. And your own way. I remember that dreaming thing. One time I was on tour, and I was with Richard Steichen and Heriberto Yepes. And Heriberto Yepes is a Tijuana, lives in Tijuana, writes multilingually, really very kind of experimental avant-garde work. Richard Steichen, you might know his first book, Crush, which won the Yale Younger Prize, and is really, really, really image-saturated work. And I woke up from this nap in the middle of the day, and we went to dinner, and I described my dream, and they were both looking at me like I was insane, because I was really kind of describing like an All My Children episode that had just happened in my brain. And Richard said, if I dream at all, it's like a color. You know, I'll wake up and be like, green. It was his dream. And Heribeto's poems, dreams were just like crazy, crazy, crazy. And mine was like an All My Children episode. And so in my subconscious, I work narratively, right? And so then I have to work into that strength and make my narratives interesting and engaging and image rich and language rich, but knowing that my strength is going to be telling a story, right? How about one more? I've silenced the crew. Oh, see, that's what I get for asking for one more question. And then the hardest question of all, that's the hardest question of all, what do you read? You know, the one place I don't read is in the shower because I wear glasses and I can't see. I have friends who read the shampoo bottles, and I felt really inferior because I don't know what my shampoo bottle says. It's the only place I can't read. But I'll read anything well, that's not true, actually. I don't like bad literature. I don't like not well-written literature because it just makes me mad. It's a waste of my time, in a sense, if they haven't taken that time to tighten it up. But any kind of good literature from any country, any time period that is going to teach me things about a way of looking at the world that I hadn't thought about and a way of writing about the world that I hadn't thought about, I love. So I've talked about Lucille Clifton. I love Lucille Clifton. I love Robert Haas. I love Juan Ramon Jimenez. I love Sappho. The list could go on and on. We just moved into a new place, my husband and I, who's also a reader and a scholar, and we have a whole room for books, and there are still books not unpacked from their boxes. Yeah, it's a sick pairing between the two of us. So it's my little obsession, I guess. I guess of obsessions, it's not the most unhealthy one, but it just means I have trouble answering that question. Okay, so here's what I'll do. I will go wherever they tell me to sign books, and I will happily sign your books, and I'm happy to answer questions individually if you have them. Thank you very much for being such a great, attentive audience, and enjoy this warm, beautiful, a little bit wet Iowa spring. So where is it they want me to sing? So where is it they want me to sing? So where is it they want me to sing? So where is it they want me to sing? So where is it they want me to sing? So where is it they want me to sing? So where is